He died 30 years ago. Yesterday, his letter arrived. A Walter Hayes mystery. In Greyford, Missouri, the dead usually stayed quiet. They had their names carved into stone on the hill above town. They had flowers placed on their graves every spring, and old stories told about them in careful voices at church suppers, diner booths, and family porches. But on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, Henry Ellis spoke again. Not in a dream, not through a ghost, not through anything Greyford could easily explain. He spoke through a letter. The envelope arrived in the mailbox of his sister, Margaret Ellis, just after 8 in the morning. It was thin, yellowed, and soft around the edges, as if it had spent many years pressed between old books or hidden inside a drawer that no one had opened in decades. Margaret was 73 years old. She lived alone in a white house on Briar Lane, with a screened porch, 2 rocking chairs, and a kitchen clock that had not kept the correct time since her husband died. She found the letter while wearing her house slippers and an old blue cardigan, the kind of sweater people keep long after it has stopped being warm, because someone they loved once said it suited them. At first, she thought it was a bill. Then she saw the handwriting. Her hand tightened around the envelope. The rain tapped softly on the metal mailbox behind her. For almost a full minute, Margaret did not move. The name on the front was hers, Mrs. Margaret Ellis. The address was correct, but the handwriting belonged to a man who had been dead for 30 years. Her brother, Henry. Margaret carried the envelope back into the house like it might break apart if she held it too firmly. She sat at the kitchen table, under the pale yellow light above the sink, and opened it with a butter knife. Inside was one sheet of paper. No greeting, no explanation, only one sentence, written in dark blue ink. Don't let them bury the truth with Henry. At the bottom of the page was a name. Henry Ellis. Margaret read it once, then again. Then she pressed her hand against her mouth and looked toward the old framed photograph on the wall. Henry stood in that picture at 29 years old, smiling beside a pickup truck, one arm resting on the open door. He had dark hair then, a narrow face, and the kind of smile that made people believe he was always about to say something funny. He had died on October 14, 1994. His truck had gone off the road near Blackwater Bridge, 6 miles outside Greyford. The official report said the pavement had been wet. The curve had been sharp. Henry had been driving too fast. A tragic accident. That was what Greyford had called it. That was what the sheriff's office had written. That was what everyone had repeated until the words became easier than the truth. But Margaret had never believed it, because 7 days before Henry died, he had stood in that very kitchen, soaked from the rain, nervous in a way she had never seen before. He had looked out the window twice before speaking. Then he said something Margaret carried for the rest of her life. "If something happens to me, Maggie, it won't be an accident." She had asked him what he meant. He had told her he could not say yet. 3 days later, he stopped answering her calls. 4 days after that, he was found dead under Blackwater Bridge, and 30 years later, his letter arrived. Margaret did not take the letter to the sheriff first. She thought about it. She even put on her coat and stood by the front door with her purse in her hand. But then she imagined Sheriff Daniel Cole's face when she told him that her dead brother had sent her a message. Daniel was a good man, practical, careful, the kind of man who believed in forms, timelines, and evidence that could be sealed in plastic bags. Margaret was afraid he would be kind to her. Kindness was sometimes worse than disbelief. So instead, she walked 3 blocks in the rain to the small brick house at the end of Maple Street, where Walter Hayes lived with his books, his old case files, and a kettle that was always left on the stove a little too long. Walter Hayes was 69 years old. retired homicide detective. Gray hair, calm eyes, old coat, a slow walk. In Greyford, people spoke about him the way they spoke about bad weather, old wounds, and church bells. He had always been there, or at least it felt that way. Walter was not official anymore. He had no badge, no squad car, no authority, except the kind that came from having seen too much and forgotten very little. When Margaret knocked, Walter opened the door before the second knock finished. He looked at her face, then at the envelope in her hand. Then he stepped aside. "Come in, Margaret." She sat at his kitchen table while rain moved down the windows in thin silver lines. Walter did not interrupt her. That was one of the things people noticed about him. He never rushed grief. He never tried to make fear sound smaller than it was. Margaret told him about the letter, about Henry, about the night in 1994, about the sentence he had said in her kitchen. "If something happens to me, it won't be an accident." When she finished, Walter picked up the envelope. He did not read the letter first. He looked at the paper, the fold, the stamp, the way the address had been written. He held it close to the light, then set it down gently on the table. Margaret watched him like she was waiting for a verdict. Finally, Walter said, "Letters don't come back from the dead." Margaret looked down. Then Walter added, "People send them. The question is, who wanted you to read this now?" That afternoon, Walter took the letter to Sheriff Daniel Cole. Daniel Cole was 52, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, and tired in the way small-town sheriffs become tired. Not from gunfights or car chases, but from domestic calls, missing dogs, bar arguments, unpaid fines, and the slow pressure of everyone in town expecting him to know everything. He stood behind his desk with the letter in his hand. "You're telling me this came in the mail yesterday?" Daniel asked. "Margaret found it this morning," Walter said. "And you think it's real?" Walter gave him a look. "I think paper is real, ink is real, stamps are real. Motives usually are too." Daniel sighed. He read the letter again. "Don't let them bury the truth with Henry." "Henry Ellis," Daniel said. "That was before my time." "You were in high school," Walter said. "I remember the accident. Everyone remembers the accident." Walter looked toward the window. Outside, Greyford's main street was dull and wet. The diner sign blinked in the rain. A delivery truck passed slowly, its tires whispering over the road. "Some accidents are remembered because they were accidents," Walter said. "Some are remembered because people worked hard to call them that." Daniel leaned back against his desk. "You're asking me to reopen a 30-year-old case because of a letter from a dead man." "No," Walter said. "I'm asking you to look at why someone wanted Margaret Ellis to believe her brother had something left to say." Daniel did not answer right away. That was as close to yes as Walter needed. The official file on Henry Ellis was thin, too thin. Walter and Daniel found it in a storage cabinet behind the old interview room, in a cardboard box labeled 1994, Traffic Fatalities. The file contained the basic report: date, time, location, weather, vehicle damage, cause of death. No sign of foul play, no witnesses, case closed. There were 4 photographs, all badly faded. Henry's truck at the bottom of the embankment, the curve near Blackwater Bridge, a broken fence rail, mud tracks near the shoulder of the road. Walter stared at the last photograph longer than the others. Daniel noticed. "What?" Walter tapped the edge of the picture. "Tracks. From the truck?" "No. Henry's truck went down the embankment. These are on the shoulder. Could have been from emergency vehicles." Walter looked at the date written on the back. The photo was taken before the body was removed, before the tow truck, before half the town drove out to see what happened. Daniel's jaw tightened. You think another vehicle was there. I think the photograph thinks so. Daniel hated when Walter said things like that, mostly because Walter was usually right. By 4 o'clock, Walter was sitting in the office of the Greyford Gazette, surrounded by old newspaper boxes, dust, and the faint smell of burnt coffee. Emily Carter stood on a chair, reaching for a bound archive from 1994. Emily was 34, sharp-eyed, patient, and just stubborn enough to make people tell her things they had not meant to say. She wrote for the local paper, though Walter suspected she often treated the newspaper as an excuse to investigate the town's memory. She dropped the heavy volume onto the table. October 1994, she said. You owe me a coffee for this. You drink too much coffee. You solve too many dead cases. Walter opened the archive. The article about Henry Ellis had been published 2 days after the crash. Local man killed near Blackwater Bridge. Emily read over his shoulder. Henry Ellis, 29, died late Friday night after his vehicle left County Road 11 near Blackwater Bridge. Officials believe slick pavement contributed to the crash. Walter moved his finger down the column. No mention of alcohol, he said. Was there supposed to be? People said he'd been drinking. Emily frowned. Who said that? Everybody. That's not a source. No, Walter said. But in Greyford, sometimes it becomes one. Emily turned the page. There's something else. She pointed to a photograph from the County Harvest Fair, published the same week Henry died. The image showed a row of local men standing near a banner for a charity auction. Walter recognized Henry immediately. Younger, smiling, alive. But he was not alone. 3 people stood near him. Robert Vale, then in his 40s, now one of the wealthiest men in town. Caleb Morris, former deputy sheriff. And Linda Price, a woman Walter remembered from the kind of rumors people pretended not to enjoy. Emily leaned closer. Robert Vale looks like he owned half the town even back then. He was working on it, Walter said. And Caleb Morris? Deputy, quiet man, too quiet sometimes. Emily looked at Linda Price in the photograph. She's standing very close to Henry. Walter did not answer. Emily smiled faintly. There it is. What? The thing you don't want to say because it sounds like gossip. Walter closed the newspaper volume. Gossip is just information that hasn't found a courtroom yet. By evening, they had a list of names. Robert Vale, Caleb Morris, Linda Price, and Earl Whitcomb, the old postman who had handled the Briar Lane route in 1994. Earl was the first name Walter underlined. Not because he looked guilty, because letters had habits. They moved through hands. And Walter wanted to know which hands had touched this one. The next morning, Walter visited Linda Price. She lived in a small yellow house behind the Methodist church, with a garden full of dead marigolds and wind chimes that moved even when there was no wind. Linda was 68 now, thin, careful. Her hair was silver, pulled back tightly, and her eyes had the guarded look of someone who had spent too many years deciding which version of the truth to tell. She let Walter in, but did not offer coffee. That told him enough to begin. I'm asking about Henry Ellis, Walter said. Linda looked toward the window. I figured someone would, eventually. You knew him well. That depends on who's asking. I am. She smiled sadly. Yes, I knew him well. Walter waited. Linda folded her hands in her lap. People said terrible things after he died. They said I was going to run away with him. They said my husband found out. They said Henry got drunk because I changed my mind. And did you? No. Which part? All of it. Walter watched her face. She was not lying, not about that. Henry was leaving Greyford, she said, but not with me. Why was he leaving? Linda took a breath. He found something. What? I don't know. Papers, copies of something. He wouldn't tell me everything. He said the less I knew, the safer I was. Did he say who he was afraid of? Linda's eyes shifted. There it was. Not grief, fear. After 30 years, fear had survived everything else. Henry worked nights at Vale Storage, she said. Robert Vale owned 3 warehouses back then. One of them was near the old rail line. Henry said he found a box that wasn't supposed to be there. What kind of box? Land records, county papers, deeds, maybe. I didn't understand half of it. Walter's face did not change, but the room seemed to get smaller. Land near Blackwater Bridge? Linda looked at him. You already know. No, Walter said. I'm listening. She swallowed. Henry said Robert Vale was buying land through other people's names. Old farms, river property, cheap pieces no one cared about. Then suddenly there was talk of a new bypass road. People said Vale knew before anyone else. And Henry had proof? He said he had copies. Where was he taking them? I don't know. Linda. She looked down. Maybe to the county clerk in Millhaven. Maybe to a lawyer. He never made it. Walter stood slowly. At the door, Linda spoke again. Detective Hayes? Walter turned. Henry wasn't drunk that night. I know. Her face trembled. He was scared, but he wasn't drunk. Walter nodded once. I know. The false story had done its work well. Henry Ellis had not only died in 1994, his character had been quietly buried afterward. A little drinking rumor, a little romance rumor, a little suggestion that he had been careless, emotional, reckless, enough to make people stop asking questions. That was one of the oldest tricks in a guilty town. If you could not explain the death, you explained the dead. Walter spent the next 2 days moving through Greyford slowly. He visited the county records office. He spoke to an old road engineer who remembered the proposed bypass. He sat with Frank Miller at the diner, where the coffee was bad and the memories were worse. Frank Miller was 71, a friend of Walter's, and a man who remembered everything people wished he would forget. Frank listened to the story while cutting a piece of apple pie with the side of his fork. Henry Ellis, Frank said. Good kid. He was 29. At my age, that's a kid. Walter waited. Frank chewed slowly. You want to know what people said, or what people knew? Both. What people said was that Henry had trouble with Linda Price's husband. What people knew was that Henry had trouble with Robert Vale. Walter leaned back. What kind of trouble? Henry caught something at the warehouse. A box. That's what I heard. Week before he died, he asked Earl Whitcomb how much it would cost to send a certified letter. Walter looked up. Earl told you that? Earl told everybody everything after 2 beers, until Henry died. Then he stopped talking altogether. What happened to Earl? Frank wiped his mouth with a napkin. Quit the post office not long after. Moved to Arkansas, I think. He's back. Frank nodded. Cancer. Staying with his niece out on Route 6. Walter looked toward the window. Across the street, an old woman walked under a black umbrella. 2 boys rode bicycles through puddles. Greyford looked peaceful, almost innocent. Walter had learned long ago that innocence was sometimes just distance. From the right angle, every town looked clean. He found Earl Whitcomb the next morning. The house on Route 6 sat behind a row of wet cedar trees, with a rusted mailbox leaning toward the ditch. Earl's niece answered the door and led Walter into a back room that smelled of medicine, old blankets, and wood smoke. Earl Whitcomb lay in a recliner by the window. He was 81, pale, thin, and breathing with effort. His hands rested on the blanket like small birds. Walter introduced himself. Earl gave a weak smile. I know who you are. Then you know why I'm here. Earl closed his eyes. Henry. Walter sat beside him. Outside, the wind moved through the cedars. For a while, neither man spoke. Then Walter placed the envelope on the small table beside the recliner. Earl opened his eyes and looked at it. His face changed, not surprise. Recognition. Walter said, "You sent it." Earl's mouth tightened. "Yes." "Why now?" Earl stared at the ceiling. "Because I'm dying, and dying makes a coward start counting." Walter said nothing. Earl turned his head slightly. "Henry came to me 2 days before the crash. He had a letter, sealed. Said if anything happened to him, I was to make sure Margaret got it." "Did you know what was inside?" "No." "But you didn't send it." Earl's eyes filled with shame. "No. Why?" Earl swallowed hard. The day after Henry died, Caleb Morris came to the post office. Walter felt the name settle into the room. Caleb Morris. Former deputy. Retired for years now. Still respected by half the town. Still invited to Memorial Day ceremonies. Still seen drinking coffee at the counter in Murray's diner every Sunday morning. Earl continued. Caleb asked if Henry had left anything with me. I lied, said no. He looked at me like he knew. Then he said some things are better left alone. Said Margaret had already lost enough. Said if I cared about her, I wouldn't make it worse. Walter's voice was soft. That scared you? Earl gave a bitter laugh that turned into coughing. I was a mailman detective, he was a deputy. Back then, men like Caleb didn't need to threaten you, they just needed to stand close enough. What did you do with the letter? Hid it in my old postal bag. Took it with me when I left town. And 30 years later? My niece cleaned out my storage unit, found the bag, found the letter. I saw Henry's handwriting again and couldn't sleep for 3 nights. So, you mailed it. Earl nodded. I put it in a new envelope. The old one was ruined. Damp got to it. I copied Margaret's address from the original. Walter watched him carefully. But the note inside, that was Henry's? Earl's eyes moved to the letter. No. Walter did not move. Earl whispered, the original was longer. Where is it? Earl's hand trembled as he pointed toward the dresser. In the Bible. Walter opened the drawer and found a black leather Bible with cracked edges. Between the pages of Ecclesiastes was a folded sheet of paper. Older than the one Margaret had received, more fragile. Written in the same hand. Walter unfolded it gently. Margaret, if you're reading this, then I was right to be afraid. I found documents in Vale's warehouse. Land deeds, county maps, payment records. Robert Vale has been buying property through other names, and Deputy Caleb Morris knows about it. I made copies. I hid them where Dad used to keep the fishing tackle, under the loose board behind the stairs. If something happens to me, take this to someone outside Greyford. Do not trust the sheriff's office. I'm sorry, Maggie. Henry. Walter read the letter twice. Then he folded it back along the same lines. Earl watched him. I was afraid, Earl said. I know. I let that boy stay dead wrong. Walter looked at him. No, whoever killed him did that. Earl's eyes closed, but I helped the silence. Walter did not argue. Some truths did not need softening. That afternoon, Walter returned to Margaret's house. She stood in the hallway while he knelt beside the staircase. The old Ellis house had belonged to Margaret and Henry's father before it passed to her. Walter counted the boards under the stairs, then pressed his fingers along the wood. One board moved, not much, just enough. Margaret covered her mouth. Walter lifted it. Underneath was an old metal fishing tackle box. The hinges were rusted. Inside were papers wrapped in oilcloth. Copies of land deeds, county planning maps, payment records, names, dates, signatures. Robert Vale's name did not appear on every document. That was the point. But the same 3 shell buyers appeared again and again, all connected to Vale through business records. The land surrounded the area near Blackwater Bridge and the proposed bypass. And there, on 2 handwritten payment notes, was another name: Caleb Morris. Daniel Cole arrived 20 minutes later. He stood in Margaret's dining room, looking at the documents spread across the table. For once, he had nothing practical to say. Emily Carter arrived next, carrying her recorder, a notebook, and the expression of someone trying not to look too satisfied that the old newspaper archives had mattered. Margaret sat silently in the corner. She had waited 30 years for the truth. Now that it was there, it looked smaller than grief and heavier than stone. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face. "This is enough to open an investigation," he said. Walter looked at him. It was enough 30 years ago. Daniel did not answer. That was one of the hard things about being the sheriff in a town like Greyford. Sometimes the sins in your files belong to men who wore the same badge before you. Caleb Morris lived on Oak Hollow Road, in a red brick ranch house with an American flag by the porch and a Sheriff's Association sticker in the front window. He answered the door before Daniel knocked twice. Caleb was 76 now, heavy around the middle, white-haired, and still standing like a man who expected rooms to respect him. His eyes moved from Daniel to Walter, then back again. "Well," Caleb said, "took longer than I thought." Daniel's hand rested near his belt. "Caleb Morris, we need to ask you some questions about Henry Ellis." Caleb looked past them toward the street. A neighbor was pretending to rake leaves across the road. Greyford always knew when history was arriving. Caleb stepped back. "Come in." He did not confess right away. Men like Caleb rarely did. They gave pieces. They tested what you knew. They corrected small details to feel in control. At first, he said Henry had misunderstood what he found. Then he said Robert Vale had not done anything illegal, not exactly. Then he said Henry had threatened to ruin good men over paperwork. Walter listened. Daniel asked the official questions. Emily waited outside because Daniel had insisted. Finally, Walter placed Henry's original letter on the coffee table. Caleb stared at it. Something in his face loosened. "Earl," he said. Walter said he kept it. Caleb laughed once, without humor. "Of course he did. Weak men always keep things. Makes them feel brave later." Daniel's face hardened. "What happened at Blackwater Bridge?" Caleb looked at Daniel. "You weren't there." "No, Henry was." Caleb's jaw shifted. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. There it was. The sentence guilty men use when they want the crime to sound like bad weather. Caleb leaned back in his chair. Vale wanted the papers back, that's all. Henry was running his mouth. Said he was going to Millhaven, said he had copies. Robert was afraid the bypass deal would collapse. "So, Vale sent you?" Walter said. "He asked me to talk sense into him. At night, on a wet road, near a bridge." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "I followed him. Put my lights on. He pulled over near the curve. We argued. He wouldn't give me the box." "What box?" "Documents. Copies. I thought all of them were there. But he had already hidden another set." Caleb looked at the letter. "I didn't know that," Daniel said. "How did the truck go off the road?" Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Henry tried to leave. I grabbed the door. He shoved me. I hit him." Margaret's brother had been dead for 30 years, but the room seemed to hold its breath for him. Caleb continued. "He fell against the truck. I thought he was just stunned. I panicked. I put him back in the driver's seat. The truck rolled. I swear to God, I didn't think it would go over. Walter did not blink. Did you push it? Caleb looked at him. The silence answered first. Then Caleb said, I gave it a shove. Daniel stood. Caleb Morris, you're under arrest. Caleb looked almost relieved, not sorry, just tired of holding the door shut against the past. Robert Vale died 2 years before the truth came out. That was one of the cruelties Margaret had to accept. The man who paid for silence never had to hear it break, but Caleb Morris did, and Greyford did. Emily Carter published the story the following Sunday. Not as a scandal, not as a ghost story, not as a tale of a dead man sending letters from beyond the grave. She wrote it as a record of what had happened. Henry Ellis had discovered corruption. Henry Ellis had tried to expose it. Henry Ellis had been killed because someone powerful wanted him quiet. And for 30 years, the town had accepted an easier story. That he was drunk, that he was reckless, that he was running away with another man's wife, that the road was wet, that the curve was sharp, that sometimes accidents just happen. Walter read the article at Murray's Diner with a cup of black coffee cooling beside him. Frank Miller sat across from him. Good piece, Frank said. Walter nodded. Emily writes clean. That all you've got? Walter folded the paper. What else should I have? Frank looked out the window. Across the street, Margaret Ellis stood in front of the post office. She was not crying. She was not smiling. She was just standing there, holding the original letter in both hands. She waited a long time, Frank said. Walter watched her. Yes. Think it helps? Walter was quiet. Outside, the morning was clear for the first time in a week. Sunlight moved along the wet pavement. The town looked washed, but not clean. Finally, Walter said, Truth doesn't give back what was taken. Frank looked at him. Walter continued, but it stops the lie from taking anything more. Later that day, Walter drove to Blackwater Bridge. He went alone. The road curved through a line of old sycamore trees before crossing the narrow river. Below the bridge, the water moved slowly over dark stones. On rainy nights, the place still looked dangerous. On clear days, it looked almost ordinary. That was the trouble with places where terrible things happened. They did not always look haunted. Sometimes they looked like anywhere else. Walter parked on the shoulder and stepped out. The air smelled of mud, leaves, and cold water. For a while, he stood where Henry Ellis had pulled over 30 years earlier. He looked at the curve, the ditch, the repaired fence, the slope down to the river. He imagined the truck, the argument, the documents, the fear. A young man trying to leave Greyford with the truth in his hands. An older man wearing a badge, deciding that silence was worth more than a life. Walter had seen many murders in his time. Some were loud, some were bloody, some were desperate and stupid and over in seconds. But the worst ones were quiet. The ones that continued after the body was found. The ones that kept killing a person's name, their memory, their truth. Henry Ellis had died in 1994. But the lie had lived until yesterday. Walter took the copy of the false letter from his coat pocket, the one Earl had sent. Don't let them bury the truth with Henry. It had not been Henry's exact sentence, not from the original letter. But maybe it had been what Earl needed to say. Maybe it was what Margaret needed to hear. Maybe, after 30 years of silence, even a frightened man could still do one brave thing before the end. Walter folded the paper and put it away. Behind him, a car slowed on the bridge. It was Margaret. She parked a few yards behind his car and stepped out carefully. She wore the same blue cardigan under her coat. For a moment, they stood without speaking. Then Margaret looked down toward the river. "He hated this bridge," she said. Walter turned slightly. "Henry?" She nodded. "When we were kids, he said it looked like something waiting with its mouth open." Walter looked at the dark line under the bridge. "Smart kid." Margaret gave a small laugh, but it broke before it became anything more. "I spent 30 years wondering if I failed him." Walter said, "You didn't. I should have pushed harder. You were grieving. I knew he was scared. And now, everyone else knows why." Margaret held the original letter in her hand. The paper moved slightly in the wind. "I keep thinking about Earl," she said. "I want to hate him." Walter did not answer. "But I can't," she continued. "Not all the way. He was afraid. I understand afraid." Walter looked at the water. Fear makes accomplices out of ordinary people. Margaret looked at him. "And what makes them stop?" Walter thought for a moment. "Usually pain." They stood there until the sun dropped behind the trees and the river turned the color of old metal. Before leaving, Margaret placed a small white flower near the fence rail. There was already a grave for Henry Ellis in the cemetery on the hill. But some places needed markers that were not official. Some truths needed to be left exactly where the lie began. A week later, Earl Whitcomb died. Margaret went to the funeral. So did Walter. So did Daniel Cole. Not many others came. Earl had lived too long with something people could not see, and died just after showing it to them. Greyford did not always know what to do with that kind of man. At the cemetery, Margaret stood beside Earl's niece and held her hand. Walter watched from under an oak tree. Daniel came to stand beside him. "You think she forgave him?" Daniel asked. Walter looked at Margaret. "No." Daniel nodded slowly. "But she came." Walter put his hands in his coat pockets. "Sometimes that's all forgiveness can manage." Daniel was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I've been going through old files." Walter glanced at him. "Have you?" "Cases from the 90s, missing persons, accidents, things that closed too neatly." Walter said nothing. Daniel gave him a tired look. "Don't look pleased." "I wasn't." "You were thinking it." Walter almost smiled. Across the cemetery, the wind moved through the grass. The stones stood in uneven rows, holding names Greyford had spoken for generations, and others it had avoided. Daniel looked toward town. "You know what bothers me most?" "What?" "That nobody needed to be a monster for this to happen. Vale was greedy. Caleb was loyal to the wrong man. Earl was scared. People gossiped because gossip was easier than doubt. The file got closed because closed files are convenient." Walter nodded. "That's how most towns do their worst work." Daniel looked at him. "And men like you spend retirement making the rest of us uncomfortable." Walter put on his hat. "Somebody has to have a hobby." Daniel shook his head, but he smiled. A little. That evening, Margaret Ellis returned home and placed Henry's original letter in a frame. Not in the hallway, not where visitors could ask about it. She placed it on the small table beneath his photograph in the kitchen. For 30 years, that photograph had been a memory. Now, it was evidence. Not evidence for a court, not anymore. Evidence that Henry had been more than the story Greyford told about him. A brother, a son, a man who saw something wrong and tried to stop it. Outside her window, Briar Lane settled into night. Porch lights came on one by one. A dog barked twice. Somewhere in town, the church bell rang the hour. Greyford looked peaceful again. It always did. That was part of its talent. The town could absorb almost anything. A funeral, a scandal, a confession, a name cleared after 30 years. Give it a week, and the diner would be full again. The post office would open at 8. The Gazette would land on porches. People would talk, then lower their voices, then move on. But not everything went back into the ground. Some stories stayed loose. They moved through conversations, through old photographs, through names people suddenly said more carefully. Henry Ellis had been dead for 30 years, but yesterday his letter arrived, and in Greyford, Missouri, that was enough to remind everyone of something Walter Hayes had learned long ago. The past does not stay buried because people forget. It stays buried because people agree not to dig. And sooner or later, someone always stops agreeing. Some towns don't bury their dead only in cemeteries. They bury them in paperwork, in rumors, in silence, in the soft, polite voices of people who say it was a long time ago. But truth is patient. It can sit in a postal bag for 30 years. It can wait inside a Bible. It can hide under a loose stairboard in a rusted tackle box. And when it finally comes home, it does not knock loudly. Sometimes it arrives in the morning mail, thin, yellowed, almost forgotten, with a dead man's name at the bottom, and one sentence strong enough to wake an entire town. Don't let them bury the truth.